Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Creative Coast Lunchtime Topics. Today is Wednesday, January 13th, and we're so excited today to have longtime Creative Coast community member and contributor Erik Reagan, who is the partner and CEO of Focus Lab, a renowned and award-winning design firm here in Savannah. Since he co-founded Focus Lab in 2010, he has learned a thing or two about team leadership. One of the utmost priorities and core values of the Focus Lab team is people over profits, a standard that he and the Focus Lab team strive to hold one another to and improve upon continually. So Erik, along with his his partners, Bill Kenny and Will Strawn, really work hard to make people a focus of their team and their work at Focus Lab, and it shows in their results with their customers as well. So today, Erik's going to share what he has learned about being an intentional leader, and I can vouch to that. I've known Erik probably about a decade now, and he's one of the most intentional people I've ever met, and he really strives to focus on doing good and being someone who is present and with a focus on people and all that he does. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Erik, and thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate, for that intro, for having me, of course. It's interesting. The context of this I love because you've set the stage beautifully by lifting me up, and I'm going to go ahead and just bring myself down a couple notches because there's a lot of irony in this. And so this is how I'm going to lead this thing out. Kate, you reached out to me in December and said, hey, we're looking at some programming stuff for the next quarter. And I was so excited to hear from you. I've been a big fan of and participator in Creative Coast things for a decade plus. And you mentioned the topic about intentional leadership, the timing of it being at the beginning of a year makes a lot of sense. And I put it on my calendar. I was really stoked. And then yesterday, Monday, because time flies. Monday morning, it kind of occurred to me, so is this a Q&A or is it like a presentation I don't remember the context of the content. So I went back and kind of looked at our emails and realized I think I have misassumed that this is a free-flowing conversation as opposed to something that maybe I should prepare a little bit for. So I checked in like, hey Kate, just want to make sure that I got the right kind of expectation here. And I just thought that was hilarious because I was completely wrong in my assumption. And I was finding that really funny that I'm supposed to talk about being intentional. And I just kind of assumed some stuff and it was wrong. And there was not a lot of intention there. So wanted to bring myself down a couple of notches, before we get in. But I'm really excited to share some stuff. The way that you have marketed or shared this in the emails and on social media, it helped me because you said that I plan to share a thing or two. And I said, oh, I can do that. I can do that pretty quickly. I'll pick two things. I'm going to share two things. So that's kind of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to share two things about being intentional, both with self-leadership and then the leadership of others, because I think both can be really applicable, even if you may not have like a leadership role in an organization. So before I do that, I do want to give Creative Coast some longtime props. I got a little curious as I was thinking about preparing for this. I got curious about when did I actually first cross paths with the Creative Coast? So for me, what that means is I'm going to my inbox. I'm going to search for the Creative Coast and see what comes up. And it went back to 2007 was my first record of email. And it was where I was just kind of following the job board because I had a full-time job somewhere else. I had this itch to start a web design company is kind of how I thought of it at the time. Wasn't really sure when or how to do that. Never ran a business before. So I was just kind of watching for job opportunities while thinking about maybe someday starting something. About a year later, 2008, I made first contact. So I reached out to the Creative Coast and said, hey, I see on your website that you kind of help new businesses get the ball rolling as they kind of launch. What does that mean? How do I kind of think about this? I want to start a business someday. I had no idea, again, about the timing, when I would be able to start a business. I didn't have a goal of when to start the business. I just knew I wanted to at some point. And so that was 2008, got some good feedback. They told me about the events that they held, and I started meeting people in the community around us in Savannah. And it took a couple of years after that, but eventually in May of 2010, I quit my day job and fully started this business with no other revenue or income, rather, for myself. So that was the big plunge. I've benefited so much over the years from the Creative Coast, from the networking aspects of just getting to meet people who are like-minded and very likely farther down the road than I am. The content that has been brought into different events has also really helped me. Just a lot of different ways that the Creative Coast has been a big value. Even through the past decade of being in business, we've evolved, and the Creative Coast has even seen its own evolution, and we've continued to benefit in different ways throughout that. And so I don't know how necessary, I don't think it's maybe necessary, but I wanted to start by just saying thank you to the Creative Coast. Kate, you've been doing so much for so many years now. Certainly appreciate you and all the time that you put into just different entrepreneurs in the area and folks who are just trying to make the world a better place through some form of business. So I'm grateful for everyone at the Creative Coast.
Thank you.
There are two categories that I want to speak to, like I mentioned. There's this intentional self-leadership, and then there's the intentional leadership of those around us. And so I want to start by just touching on a couple of simple ideas within the context of self-leadership. And the stuff I'm going to say today is pretty basic. There's nothing that's really complex. In fact, I believe that in these circumstances, we need something simple that we can actually do something with, not a huge list of 16 things to be thinking about. So I'm only going to share these two contexts. The first one, I'm sneaking in a second lesson. So I kind of have three things, but I'm calling it two. So the first thing around self-leadership requires that I tell you a little bit about Erik before web design, or branding, as my agency is today, a branding agency. So when I was in college, I was studying to be a music teacher, essentially. I was also interested in computer programming. And then I got about two semesters through music education and looked at the future of how long I'd need to be there to complete my degree. I was not too stoked about how long it took the average music education student to complete that degree. And so I decided to switch. I'm not a fan of school. Huge fan of learning, not a big fan of school. I switched my major to computer science because I had an interest in that. And then I met a girl. I actually met a girl earlier in the story, but I met a girl and I was like, I want to marry her, but I can't pay bills right now. So I actually dropped out of school after almost 3 semesters of college. And I just started working full time. I needed 3 jobs at the time, one of which was freelance web development, one of which was leading worship or music at a church. And then the third one, which ended up being where most of my initial income came from, was working at Zales Diamonds. I sold jewelry. It was fun. It was fun mainly because I just was fascinated by gems and just the elements and the things that they looked like or could look like if they were treated in certain ways. And I really started to appreciate diamonds, not because they're a girl's best friend, not because they're so rare and so valuable, but I was really intrigued by the composition of them and what even makes a diamond reflect light the way that it does, what makes a diamond look the way that it does. And later in life, I was able to kind of look backwards at that time and say, man, diamonds can tell us a lot about what it's like for us to develop. And so I kind of ended up with this analogy that I've really enjoyed and benefited from over the years. So really like high level 101 intro to how diamonds become the diamonds that we buy at stores. They are carbon, they're very compressed carbon. And when they come out of the earth, they don't look great. I think most of y'all are aware of that. But before they even are visible to us or mineable by us, they have to go through an intense amount of pressure and time to become this compacted, lump of carbon. And when it's at that stage, this diamond has experienced this this compression or this time, and comes out not looking like much, but it's got at its core, it has the components or the attributes needed to form into something different. And so people go and mine diamonds, and we'll skip past that because that could get dramatic or crazy depending on your awareness of how that industry works. But diamonds themselves, they get into someone's hands who essentially is a craftsman. They can look past the rough diamond and see opportunity within it to say, okay, based on the size, this shape, we can probably create a single stone that looks like this or multiple stones that look like that. And the next step is to start to cut and shape this diamond. Now, I'm going to simplify a lot of things just for some context, but generally speaking, over the history of diamonds being produced for jewelry in particular, they need to be cut down. And diamonds are among the hardest material that we have. And gems, they are kind of at the top of this list of how gems are ranked in terms of their hardness. And so the question then is, well, how do we cut the hardest thing that we have? And it's really interesting the ways that we have come up with to cut a diamond or to shape a diamond. And most common, you actually need either a wheel or a knife or a blade of some kind that is coated with other diamonds, because you need something as hard as it to cut and to start shaping it. And so the first thing that kind of jumped at me as I sort of stumbled upon this analogy was, man, we value diamonds, generally speaking, on average. There is a perceived value of diamonds, but we also just acknowledge like they look good. There's some good, attractive qualities to it, but they don't remotely start off that way. In fact, it's almost the opposite. They look very unappealing when they're starting off. And in fact, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of pressure for them to start to form. And I mean, it's almost on the nose. Our personalities, our skills, our abilities are very much like that. Like they start in a shape where, unless you've got kind of a trained eye, you probably don't notice like that person has some things at their core. And that's probably a result of pressure they've experienced over time. And now it's a great time to start helping shape that person. Or maybe if you look at it from a self perspective, I want to be shaped. So how do I begin that process? Well, what I want to say is that each of us can be kind of like a diamond. And if we want to be shaped, we need other diamonds around us. And I see that as kind of a communal thing. In a lot of ways, I've seen that through and in the Creative Coast. We've got community members who are diamonds further down the road, or they're diamonds that are set up in a way that they're specifically made to cut and shape other diamonds. And you can't really shape a diamond with something that's softer. I'll just pick on a sapphire, which is also a very hard gem, a blue gem generally, and it's hard, but it's not enough to cut and to shape a diamond. We need to surround ourselves with other people who have spent that time and have been under that pressure and can help shape us. And if you're familiar with Stephen Covey, his wildly popular book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he has one of his 7 habits is to sharpen the saw. And so there's some similarity here in that you need to spend time sharpening your saw or shaped by other diamonds, so that you are sharper, so that you can do more. And also you kind of just become more valuable to those around you. And I'm not speaking about money necessarily when I say valuable here. I'm talking about the way that you can bring value through relationship, through perspective, through challenging someone. And sure, you can make money along that way. There's value in that as well. But I just loved how many parallels there were to diamonds and kind of a well-formed, well-shaped, valuable person in a sense. And not trying to speak to intrinsic value. That's another conversation that I personally do really love to talk about, but really just talking about value to those around you and a unified effort to work on something together. So how does that align or relate to intention? Well, I think we need to intentionally find diamonds around us. And sometimes that's doing something like this. Maybe it's I hop on here and I see a name, Ernesto, and I say, man, Ernesto came here. There was this topic about leadership. He seemed to be interested in that. Maybe we've got some similarities. Maybe we can go grab a drink or a meal or whatever feels appropriate in this current COVID climate, and see if we can shape one another and help be that diamond cutting tool to polish or to bring additional value. So the proactive side is what I want to emphasize. It's that we can seek out this kind of fellow diamond, if you will, or we can also be that for others around us. So it's a pretty simple idea. My charge to you in that case is simply to be proactive, knowing that we shape one another. Just consider where you're spending your time, who you're spending it with. And that takes me to the second thing about self-leadership, which is about time. And you may have said or heard someone say, I just don't have time for, and then fill in the blank, or I can't find the time to fill in the blank. A common example for me is hearing people say, I don't really have time to read that book. I don't really have time to watch that particular class online. And there's something about this phrase that's very natural, it would seem, but I want to really encourage everyone here to stop saying it, because there's a big change in the mind. If you can flip some words around, time is a much more valuable and important resource than money. We can make more money, but we can't make more time. We can talk about spending our time, but what if instead of spending our time, what if we budgeted our time? Again, thinking a little bit about money and resources, we can budget our money. Some of us choose to budget what we're going to spend it on ahead of time. We've got a plan. Well, I think we need to be doing the same thing with our time. We need to budget the time. We need to plan ahead, be strategic, be intentional. And what that looks like is you stop saying, I don't have time for this, or I can't find time for that. If you're just going to try and find time, if you're just looking for time, you're not going to find the time. So what we should be doing instead is making time or budgeting time. So if you feel like there's a book out there that you really want to read, but you just never get around to it, I would say your first step should be budget your time accordingly. So an example would just be, okay, today's Wednesday. I'm going to go ahead and just schedule an hour to read on Friday at 10 a.m. I don't have anything on the time or on the calendar at that point. I'm going to go ahead and budget that time so that I spend it in a way that reflects the things that I consider, or at least proclaim to be important. I don't recall who said this, but I've always appreciated the statement, which is that actions express priority. So if there's something that's a priority to you, your actions are demonstrating that. And sometimes our inaction also demonstrates lack of priority for certain things. And priorities are not going to be the same for everyone. I'm using a book as just a random example, just because it's come up for me in conversation many times. But maybe it's something different. Maybe you need to budget time to just be alone. Maybe you need to budget time to walk. Maybe you need to budget time to go on a date. There are so many different ways that we can be budgeting our time. And I think that thinking of it with that framing can really help us be intentional and lead to better just days in general. Now, that's not to say that surprises won't happen, but it's definitely a great starting point to start budgeting your time. So that's the second little point of the first context of self-leadership. Now, the second one, a category, if you will, has to do with leading others, leading those around us. Now, I'm going to talk about it mostly in the context of a team, and in particular, somebody who might report to you, so somebody who works for you. This is not limited to that context, but that's kind of how I'm going to be framing it. So we have a tool I have a tool that I came across a few years ago that is so simple, but insanely impactful. And it comes in the form of a tiny little book. Like I said, I talk about books and hear conversations about people budgeting time or not budgeting time to read. This comes from a tiny book. And in fact, it's probably in multiple books. The author has written dozens of them. He has written a famous series called The 1 Minute Manager. Some of you may be familiar with it. And the first book I read from him was called Self-Leadership, and the 1-minute manager. And so even then, the context was self-leadership, or not really how you report to someone or how you delegate or direct someone else. It was about self. But this tool was introduced to me through this book, and I've been really, really benefiting from it since. And it is pretty straightforward. And there's a simple premise kind of at the base of it. And the premise is this: as people, we are not capable. We don't have the same level of capability in multiple contexts, or sorry, in all contexts of the things that we do. Our ability to get things done and have or need sort of support or coaching, directing or delegating, those things differ from category to category, even within a singular job that you might have. So as an example, I seem kind of naturally drawn to writing, and I enjoy writing messages. I enjoy communication. It's, for whatever reason, like, it just feels natural to me. And I've because of that, learned over time. I've intentionally sought out like how to become a better communicator. There are just different things that feel kind of natural to me, and I've just realized over time I need a little less direction on that front than I need on something else like time management. I'm not great at time management. I probably need more support, more help. I need somebody maybe even teaching me how to manage that time better. And so that might just be a tiny piece of a job I have. And let's say, as a web developer for years, let's say that I'm pretty proficient at the code that I write, but I'm not too proficient at communicating with a customer about the code that I wrote. So the reason I give a couple of examples is to say that my abilities vary based on the tasks. And the premise kind of at the base of this tool here is that leading someone else should be contextual. It should be what they call situational. And they've got this little continuum. It's a 4-stage thing that I've found really beneficial, where they say you start in a place where you have low competence and low commitment. I'm sorry, and high commitment. And usually when you have low competence and high commitment, you know what you need to do. You're not very experienced in it, but you're gonna run into it. You're gonna go for it, and eventually you're gonna hit some walls, which actually lowers your commitment and your confidence rather, and you end up in this place where you don't feel nearly as pumped up about it as maybe you did initially. So the goal is to acknowledge, like, okay, my competence started low, my commitment started high. Now my commitment and my competence are low, but maybe my competence is a little bit, it's on the upward trend, that I'm still not quite doing well. So that's the second stage, where you've got low to some competence, low commitment. Then you get to another stage as you continue to grow and develop, where you have moderate to high competence in a task or a context, and your commitment maybe is a little bit variable. And finally, the kind of end point is you have both high competence and high commitment. And the reason that I find this really helpful is that it helps me communicate with people around me. I can actually look at this tool and say, the way that they talk about it is they use the letter D. So there's D1, D2, D3, D4. And I can look at that and say, when it comes to communicating with customers, I feel like I'm in kind of a D2 territory. And the reason this becomes really powerful, or the way that this becomes really powerful, is there is a second piece to this tool designed for the coaching side of it, or the directing side. And so if I have low competence, low commitment, then I know then my leader can know how to best support me. And in this case, it would be something where they have their own continuum that matches up with mine. So the name of this has changed over the years because of some trademark issues between the author and somebody else they used to work with. So it's not called anything terribly helpful. They call it SL2, but it's basically a leadership development continuum. And the idea is that you can match yourself up to where you fit in terms of that competence, that commitment, and your leader can be aware of it as well. It can be a fantastic discussion point or discussion starter to say, hey, I noticed that you're behind on this task again. Let's just do a quick gut check. Where would you say you are in this task? Do you feel like you're in this D1, this D2, this D3? And depending on the answer, the leader may then know, okay, well, they they're sitting at this level over here. That means that my support structure or my support design, I should be directing them more heavily, and I should be supporting them as well. But on the other side of that spectrum, when you're kind of in that final territory where you have high commitment and high competence, as a leader, or your leader then doesn't actually have to do a lot. They end up being able to essentially just delegate stuff, and you don't need much direction or support. So it's a really helpful tool. The book is Self-Leadership and the 1-Minute Manager. That's the one that I learned it from. But again, the guy who wrote this has written so many other books that I'm sure it's in other books that he has written and talked about. But I wanted to share that little continuum, because if you have a simple tool like that, you can just have a conversation intentionally, proactively, and say, all right, we've got something new coming up. So let's mutually look at this kind of paradigm and identify where are we finding ourselves? Are we in this D1 category where you're committed, really committed, but you're not terribly competent yet, or we don't maybe know the competence level? Well, if that's the case, then this is how I'm going to support you. It's going to be pretty hands-on. It's going to be pretty frequent check-ins. It's just good to identify that. And then one little tidbit that we've also learned over the years is that we can actually think about that when we're hiring. We can think about that as we write a job description. How many job descriptions have you read where you read the requirements and you're like, that's like 6 people. What are they thinking? You can identify phrases that say something like need a self-starter, or things like that imply that your boss is going to be too busy to really be around much. Well, there's a much better way to approach it, better language to actually describe what that role would look like in practice, and also help us get realistic before we post a job. We can actually say, okay, well, if we need somebody who is high competence and high commitment, they're probably going to cost more. They're going to be more experienced. They're going to need us less, but they might also hit a ceiling sooner, perhaps, depending on your organization size and structure. So that's a tool that's been really useful to me when it comes to working with other people and being intentional on the leadership side. So those are the 3 things that I wanted to just share with you today, and really leave some space and some time to talk through how we do this with either ourselves or with others around us. So I basically figured I'd go halfway on the content side and then leave about half for any kind of questions and comments. So there we go. I'm happy to continue and dig into some questions that anybody has or thoughts.
Thanks, Eric. So let's open it up for Q&A. You can turn your video on or and unmute yourself if you'd like, and we can chat it out. Eric, I'll say that I love what you talked about in terms of budgeting your time. I think that's something we don't really think about or aren't intentional about, and how it impacts I feel like it impacts my relationships with other people and how I interact with people. And I really do think time is more valuable. I use an actual budgeting tool called You Need a Budget.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of it. And I've been using it for years, but it's really taught me how to focus in on finances. And I think, gosh, if we did that with time and like paid it as close attention and monitored it, and that's so useful. That was a great comment.
Yeah. I've benefited a lot from that, and my family has too. It's not an individual thing. When you budget your time, you're impacting others as well.
What do you use to schedule your time? Is there a certain tool, or is it like Google Calendar? What is it?
Yeah, it's literally just my calendar. I just keep it simple in that way. I'm already using my calendar for certain things, and I get invited to events by different people. And if my pre-planned time is also already on the calendar, it's not just apparent to me, but also anyone who might be trying to check my availability on the internal company side, or in certain cases through things like Calendly. If you're familiar with that app, I have my calendar to an extent sort of exposed, so people can schedule things publicly, and it allows me to still protect those budgeted time blocks by keeping it in Google Calendar. That's the method that's been most effective for me.
Cool. I've heard about Calendly. I know a lot of people that use it and put it in the bottom of their email and their signature, so that people can just schedule right from there. And it seems to work really well.
Yeah. David, hey, what you got, man?
Hello, Eric. Well, I thought I would at least show my face. I don't need to wave my hands to say I've got a question, but I wanted to just add on to what you said about the calendar and family.
Hmm.
This was advice I got a number of years ago from someone I really valued his opinion of. He had 3 kids. They were all, say, between 10 and 16 years old. And he got me then doing what he was doing. He scheduled time in his calendar for each of his kids. He would, when they got a little bit older, it would be, hey, let's go to Starbucks. And I've got you in my calendar, 3 o'clock on Tuesday. And he said, and I've experienced it myself with my 2 boys, it changed the relationship because they realized
Hmm.
they had some level of importance in your calendar as opposed to, hey, I'm working from 8 to 5, sometimes later. So, talk to me later. So just as you were talking about family, it just made me think of that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good, David. Thank you for sharing that. I might steal that.
Yeah, I think that's so important, especially with remote work, because I feel as though so many, and I've talked to so many other parents who feel as though they're working more somehow. It can be really hard to turn off at the end of the day if you just have that one more thing to do. And I know it's been a problem for me. I have a 4-year-old, and just making time on the calendar, even if it's like in the middle of the workday, and then maybe working a little bit later in the day and spending time with him, maybe working when he's asleep so that I can get things done. But that's a good comment. I like that. Anybody else have questions, comments?
Actually, since it's related, I want to just speak to that a bit, Kate, because I think many people here probably experienced a similar abrupt shift last year in terms of working in a facility versus working in a home. And I used to have the benefit of driving home from my office. So I live in Richmond Hill, office is downtown Savannah. That's a decent drive. I'd have a half hour plus, depending on traffic and when I left, to just myself. I could do whatever I wanted to. And that I treated that as almost like it might sound silly, but like almost a sacred time to shift my mind away from work. I realized years ago that I would listen to audiobooks about business. I was always in on mode. I'd get home and I couldn't shut my brain off. And it finally occurred to me that I kept it on. I was the one keeping it on business mode on my drive home. And so I got into a really good flow of my drive home being the opportunity to disconnect from work, to shift my mind, to just be present with my family. But then working from home full time just snatched that away. So one thing that became very apparent to me is I needed to build that back in somehow. And it might sound silly, but I literally stay in this room I'm in, but for an extra 30 minutes after I'm done working, and I just do whatever I feel like. I might grab a guitar off the wall. I might open a book that's not related to work. I might literally just watch some YouTube. But it's not the same every time. But that's been so helpful for me. And my kids would tell you they notice a difference as well. I come downstairs with a different look in my eyes when I've had that time to detach. So that's just, you made me think of that. So I figured I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, that's great. Jeremy Fletcher said back in the spring when we were talking about remote work, and there were some tips. Kevin Lavers too, with TechSab, Jeremy Fletcher's with Ledgerama, both in the Creative Coast community. They were talking about how having like almost a remote sort of commute that you come up with yourself. Like so Jeremy was, before he even started his work for the day, he would schedule time to do like a household chore and knock it out. And that was his time to kind of think and transition into work. And on the opposite end of what you were talking about, kind of decompressing on your way home from work and turning off, he was talking about turning on and how to get yourself in that frame of mind for those that struggle to, work when they're working remotely. I know that that's a whole different thing, but anyways.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Eric, this is Jerome. Hey, really enjoyed your discussion. Just got a quick question. How do you build these disciplines in when you're you're leading a team, you're busy, you have a family, you got so much going on, and you're one of these people that multitask and can't say no to things. How do you begin to establish some of these disciplines?
Whew, that's a good question, and could be a talk of its own.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is helpful to know is, do you have someone? It's good to think about if you have someone who can hold you accountable to something. Some of us start an organization or a business, and we don't actually have somebody who we report to, or even like a partner that we're tag teamed with. So whatever the makeup is of what you're doing, find a person who can help hold you accountable. And sometimes that's an external like coach in a sense, depending on where you are. Maybe you've got the resources to hire somebody to be that. But for me, I'm my like default mode is overcommit and don't say no. And like, it's terrible. And so I have had a long journey, and it's still in the future as well, of knowing how much to commit and how quickly to commit to something. And the biggest help that I've had, just thinking off the cuff, is having someone to hold me accountable and to say, hey, you were 3 minutes late to that thing, to our meeting again. I thought you were going to like schedule your time so that didn't happen, or something like that. So having somebody who can hold you to account, and being ready to be held to account is a big part of that. One thing I learned, I'd say kind of the hard way, I invited somebody to hold me accountable, and then I was very, I would brush it off. I wouldn't take seriously their critiques. And ultimately, they just chose to not hold me accountable or ask me about it anymore, and understandably so. So I had to learn to receive that. But that's been the biggest help for me. And I have a business partner who was able to be that in a large way for me. I understand not everybody has somebody that they're kind of tag teamed up with. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's somebody in the business community, just a peer. And a few years into owning Focus Lab, I ended up creating this like mastermind group of other agency owners, digital agency owners. And that became the new and ultimately final almost place, because I'm still doing that group today. But that became the accountability room. I knew that when I walked into that, well, it's been virtual, but when I walk into that meeting, they're going to hold me to account and say, last time you said this was that main thing that you're trying to work on. How's that been? An example is I told them one time, probably 7 years ago, that I was not intentionally spending time with my daughter, who at the time, was about 5. So back to kind of what David was speaking to, I just shared that with someone, and then they started to check in on me. So having somebody around you that you can commit to being held accountable to something like that. And then it just becomes it just boils down to doing the things that you already know you need to do. You already know you need to say no to more things. You already know you need to leave more margin in your day. You already know these things. They're all in front of us. It's just a matter of committing to and being held accountable, I think.